Hey guys, and welcome back to another Mom Chat Mondays. Today's topic is a little spicy. Today's topic is about disciplining your kids. How are y'all disciplining your kids? Because for me, my son is just now getting to the age where he knows how to say no, he knows how to be defiant. He's almost 3. So it really got me thinking, like, how are we gonna navigate this whole topic with our kids now that it's a factor? Because when you don't have kids, you can have all the opinion in the world, but it really doesn't matter because you don't have kids. And I say that respectfully. My way of thinking has completely done a 180 now that I have my kids in this world. I am a millennial, and as a millennial, I think we are the last generation to grow up with beatings. Not only that, but to grow up in a generation where beatings are acceptable. I grew up in a household where beatings were the norm. I think now if you say you beat your kids, it's more frowned upon than it was back in my day. Especially culturally, in African culture, and I do reference Africa as a continent because whether you're from Congo like myself, or Nigeria, or Tanzania, or it is normal to beat your children, and not only your own children, but also children that aren't yours if you see them acting up in the streets or what have you. I was born in Congo and we moved to America when I was about 3 years old. But our first trip back to Congo, I was 10 years old. And one of the most vivid memories I have from that trip is walking into my grandmother's house, my mother's mom, and seeing my little cousin. If I was 10, he must have been maybe 5 or 6 at the time, getting the whooping of his life by my uncle, who must have been 30 at the time. And he was putting the full weight of a grown man into this beating. And I just remember my little cousin crying and crying, and I was just so distraught looking around at the other adults in the room, and they had not a care in the world. They were just watching it happen. And I think there's a very fine line. I don't even think it's fine. There's a huge line between discipline and abuse. And a lot of us were abused, and we need to come to that realization and unpack that before we perpetuate that trauma onto our kids. So growing up in our household, my mom was a primary disciplinarian, and she would beat us with the fufu stick. That was her primary instrument of discipline, and it's this wooden stick that you use to pound fufu, but it's also a weapon. I'm laughing, but this is just my coping mechanism. She would use her slipper, she would use a remote, anything that was kind of like in reach, or she would just resort to a good old hand slap. And if that wasn't enough, then the most dreaded punishment of all was when she would say, "Wait until your dad gets home." Because my dad, he didn't really hit us too much. He kind of left that to my mom. But if my mom said, "Wait until your dad gets home," that means he was going to come in with the reinforcements, and that was not pleasant. I just remember the feeling I felt after each one, a feeling of not feeling good enough, wondering what I did wrong to warrant this kind of reaction. And that's essentially what it comes down to, is as you're beating your kids, you're telling them they did something wrong. They know they did something wrong, but you're not explaining why it was wrong and how to do better in the future. All they know is this action causes this reaction, but not understanding the full scope of the issue at hand. So to me, corporal punishment either creates liars or it creates children who become people pleasers. And in my family, my sisters became liars. No, I say that jokingly, but we recently had this conversation, and my sisters revealed to me that they would sneak out of the house and do things without telling my parents, and I became the opposite. I became a super people pleaser because I didn't want those reactions from not only my parents, but for everyone. Like, I'm a people pleaser in all aspects of my life, and I think a lot of that stems from how we were disciplined as children. I never wanted to disappoint my parents, and I just became agreeable with a lot of things that might not have even served me in the long run. Even to this day, I find myself doing things that I would rather not do just to keep the peace, just to not disappoint other people. And I'm learning to fight against that. But it's a work in progress, man. Having that ingrained to you for your whole life, it's hard to break. I remember being in the hospital, having just given birth to my son. I think it was the second day. And just looking at this little human who needs you so much in the world. And just thinking back to my childhood, and so I called my mom in the hospital and I asked her, how could you beat us the way you did? Like, you were supposed to be our biggest protector and you ended up being our biggest bully. Even thinking about it now makes me emotional because it probably broke her heart to hear that, especially in that moment. And a lot of it had to do with the hormones. Like, giving birth, it's like you have so many emotions going through you. And we've talked about it since then. And I have the best relationship with my parents now. And looking back, I know a lot of what they did was out of love and because they didn't know any better. They were raised in that culture as well, and they were just doing what they knew best. It took a lot of work internally to be able to let that hurt, let that trauma go with my parents and just enjoy them as the flawed human beings that they are. Especially now that I'm a parent myself, I can see that it's not always easy to get everything right the first time. Some of the decisions that you make, you don't know if it's the right decision, but you're just going with what you know. It is easier for me to understand my mom at that time being a stay-at-home mom when we moved to America. She was a working mom, and then when we moved to America, she became a stay-at-home mom to, at that time, 3 kids, soon to be 4 kids. And I can understand having your patience be very thin. So I give her so much grace now, looking back. Now that I'm a stay-at-home mom to my 2 kids, it is easy to get to a place where you're just like, your frustration level is up to here and it's easy to lash out. But I would never want my kids to have those feelings of resentment, of sadness, of self-hate that I had in those moments after I got the whoopings of my life. And I just wish someone back then would have been able to explain to me, you don't do something this way, this is the way I would like you to do it. It might not take 1 time, it might not take 2 times, but just being patient enough with a child, 5, 6, 7, 8, however old, and give them consequences for it that don't result in low self-worth. And it's so funny to see them interact with my kids now, because so many things that happen, they're just so jovial and happy and carefree about it now. And in my mind, all I can help but think is, wow, we would have gotten beat for that. Small things that children do, like spilling water by accident or touching something that you're not supposed to touch, like a stove or something, or talking back. That was a big one. And although I'm still a big believer that when you're talking to an elder or parent, there's a way you should do it respectfully, but not being able to question or ask why something is the way it is, I think is a huge problem. And I think it's one of the big reasons that a lot of grown-ups don't question things when it comes from an authority figure, even if it's dead wrong. I want my kids to be able to ask questions respectfully, to understand reasoning. A lot of us were raised to be compliant, and I want to fight against that. And that's why I say I've done a complete 180, because before I had kids, in my mind, I was like, I'm gonna clearly raise them how I was raised because I turned out great. No, a lot of people have the misconception that gentle parenting is just letting your kids get away with everything, and that's definitely not the case. It's more getting to a point where you're educating your kid instead of just reprimanding them in the most easiest way possible. It's so easy to slap a kid. It's much harder as a parent to teach them, to get them to understand why something is the way it is. And that's the challenge for us as parents. You literally have to teach kids every single thing in life. So much so that I truly believe in my heart that people who beat their kids now in this day and age with all the information that we have are lazy parents. Sorry, because it's so easy to slap a kid. It's much harder to teach them, to get down on their level, to get them to understand where you're coming from. It's kind of like that saying, I'm gonna mess this up, but give a man a fish and you feed him for a day. Teach a man to fish and you feed him for a lifetime. And a lot of y'all aren't teaching your men, in this case children, to fish. You're just beating them into submission. So with all that, I would love to hear your take on how you discipline your children. And respectfully, if you don't have kids, stay out of this one. I had one way of thinking before I had my son, and that completely changed after he came into this world. And something unlocks in your brain when you become a mother, when you become a parent in general, that just shifts your perspective on a lot of things. Once again, thank you so much for coming back to another episode of Mom Chat Mondays, and I'll see you guys next month. And until then, make sure you follow me on Instagram and TikTok, and I'll see you on another video. Bye.